So thank you guys for joining us for this lively discussion. I'm Heather Staines. I'm a senior consultant at Delta Think. And I also do a little bit of work for the STM Association on technologies like GetFTR and seamless access. So I get to keep a hand in the technical space. I want to get started today by just doing a little bit of a poll in the room. It's not fancy schmancy. Don't worry, you don't have to get your phones out. How many librarians do we have in the room? Okay. How many publishers do we have in the room? Oh, it's a split. How many vendors, consultants, other? Okay. Thank you for that. Just we always like to know kind of who we're talking with. And just would you say, who would say they use AI on a monthly basis? A few people, most people. How many people, keep your hands up if you use it on a weekly basis? How many of you use it on a daily basis? That's pretty good. How many of you are AI right now in front of us? So you might have to disclose that. Again, thank you for joining us for this lively discussion, The Research Assistant of the Future, Crafting an AI Agent Scholarly Code of Conduct. We've got some great speakers lined up today representing the library world, the publisher world, the infrastructure world, and we're going to start off with just a few slides, we promise, and then we will try to make it lively. No, that's not threatening, but we love to have your input, so we're going to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. Just a quick reminder of the Charleston Code of Conduct, which is available on the slide and also at the QR code there. And then, as I mentioned, each of our speakers is going to do a quick introduction. We're going to start with Apurva Shah from Wiley. Apurva is the VP for Product Management and UX. Then we will hear briefly from Ralph Youngen, who's in the center. And Ralph is the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships for the American Chemical Society. We'll then hear briefly from Aaron Tay. Aaron's Singapore Management University Head of Data and Research Services. And then next up, batting cleanup, will be Hilke Kurz, who's the CIO for STM Solutions. And when they take their turn, they will tell you just a little bit about the context and experience that they're bringing here to the table today. So I will hand it over to Apurva.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Like Heather said, I'm Apurva Shah. I work for Wiley, and my main focus is to lead our AI Gateway initiative, which we launched a couple weeks ago at the Frankfurt Book Fair. This is really an initiative to help connect different AI agents that users are using to scholarly content, expert content. And we've kind of been doing a lot of work on that over the last few months. And I also lead our user experience team, and so that kind of really ties closely into the work as well, which is really understanding where researchers are at, how they're actually using AI, and then trying to build the products and services that can serve them not just for Wiley, but for other publishers and content creators as well. I wanted to start, this is like the most text-heavy slide you can possibly imagine, but I wanted to focus on some of these key terms just to ground our discussion, because we want to have a lively discussion, but it's always helpful to ground ourselves in some key terms. For some of you who are using AI daily, this may be just boring 101, but for others, they may not have considered these definitions. And so on this page, I wanted to focus on two in particular. One is this idea of MCP, the Model Context Protocol. Some of you might have seen this come out. Anthropic, the company that developed Claude, is the one who introduced this protocol. It's kind of the most standard. It's an open protocol that anybody can use. And really, it's a standard that is HTTP for the AI web, for the agentic web. It's a way for these agents to connect to different third-party sources and tools and things like that. So the most kind of common way you may see MCP work is that it's a way that an agent like ChatGPT or Claude can connect to your Google Calendar and look at your meetings, schedule meetings for you, and so it kind of interface back and forth. And so it's an important protocol piece of technology to be aware of. The other thing that I want to talk about a lot, that we talk about a lot, is hallucination. And there's one point I want to make here, which is it's not a bug, it's a feature. And so hallucination is just happens because the AI, its job is to answer the question from the user in the most intelligent way it can. It's not trying to reach the authoritative content unless you connect it. And so when people say, well, I used the AI tool and it hallucinated a bunch of citations, well, that's because that was what it is designed to do, unless that AI is connected to a third party to a database. So it's just an important point to make, because it comes up a lot. Well, AI hallucinates. So yeah, that's kind of probabilistically what it's supposed to do. This second page is a few different points on here. The first point, most people know what LLMs are. Our conversation today is not about training those models. So when we talk about the research assistant of the future and content interfacing with different AI tools, we're not talking about the training. That happens, there's deals happening, but that's not the topic of today. The second point is on RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. This is really AI connecting to those outside sources, right? Most people experience this right now when your ChatGPT searches the web. The web, the internet, the search engine that it's using is becoming its RAG. It's actually referencing the actual first-party primary source and then bringing that back into the conversation, into the chat. The other point is about agentic AI. You've heard a lot about agentic AI. It's nothing, fancy. Really, what it is that the ability for the LLM to kind of think, quote unquote, think. It mimics the thinking process, right? And so it's thinking through and actually taking action. So it says, oh, the user wants me to schedule a meeting. I should use its Google Calendar connection to then go and schedule the meeting. And so that's the process of agentic. And it's essentially the AI saying, I can actually go do tasks on behalf of the user. And then it gets even more interesting when it starts to deploy other agents on top of it. And that's when if you start stacking on agents on top of agents, that's where it gets really interesting. And we'll talk about that a little bit. What does that mean from a researcher use case? And then the final point I want to make before I pass over to our next speaker is just really about system instructions. And this is really important. This is the prompt before the prompt, right? It's something you don't see, but it's actually giving the AI context. Some AI tools like ChatGPT have many, many page longs of system instructions. The things you may have seen before are things like, you are a helpful assistant. But it goes beyond that, right? Sometimes it can say, answer questions in a certain way, and be really sycophantic to the user, always try to answer the question no matter what. And so those types of system instructions are really what the AI has context on how it should behave. And so if we don't kind of tweak that, if we don't really understand what those instructions are, the AI is not going to behave the way you want it to. So you can't blame the AI for something it doesn't have context for. So it's just important for us to start thinking about these things and thinking about when you're using a generic tool like ChatGPT, if it doesn't have that type of context of saying, hey, you are a skeptical researcher who always cites its sources, it's going to hallucinate. It's going to just come up with whatever is the most satisfactory answer. So that's where I'll pause there, and I'll pass over to Ralph to go to the next section.
Good afternoon. Heather noted that I'm heading up strategic partnerships at ACS, but aside from my day job, I'm also the chair of the STM Association's Standards and Technology Committee. And under that committee, we have a task and finish group. It's entitled Research Content in LLMs. But what that group is really trying to do is to tell LLM developers, tell AI developers generally, how research content differs from any other type of content that they are probably looking at consuming within their applications. And when you think about it, it really comes down to the way in which science is conducted, that science is a constant state of evolutionary discovery. And we know how that evolutionary discovery in science is manifest through the scholarly communications process, but these LLM developers, these AI developers, don't understand that. And so, like, within this community here, I'm sure we probably understand what a preprint is. You know, that a preprint, you know, is something that a researcher floats out there because they're looking to get feedback on their research results. They're looking for colleagues to comment on their research results. But preprints are not meant to be conclusive, definitive results of a research study. But as AI systems go to ingest these preprints, how do they have that proper contextualization around what that really means? That's the kind of thing that we're trying to elucidate here. We consider peer review to be kind of a gatekeeper to the scientific record, but even within peer review, there are nuances that need to be contextualized. A peer-reviewed journal article that contains a promising but preliminary finding is a preliminary finding. It is not settled scientific consensus, and it should not be produced in a Gen AI response as giving a definitive answer to that subject. On the other hand, a peer-reviewed journal article that contains a broad meta-analysis on some subject in a highly cited journal, okay, that's probably getting about as close to scientific consensus as you can get, and that should take on a different type of contextualization in a Gen AI response. And then the other thing that we're eliminating is the role that publishers play in gatekeeping, in keeping that scientific record up to date. So even post-publication, when additional research is discovered that maybe calls into question those findings that have already been published, and we publish errata, we publish expressions of concern, we might have to retract an article. Again, these are things that AI developers need to understand. And there's got to be a way in which a retraction of a previously what looked to be a sound result, how is that going to be accommodated in the AI developers? So that's what the group is really looking at, to engage AI developers in understanding this kind of context. And there are other things too that we can get into that this group is looking at that I can talk a little bit more about when we get into the discussion section. So with that, Heather, I think we're going to let Aaron speak.
Yeah, is this on?
Yep.
Can I get this on for a second? Do I need to do something? Okay, thank you. So just 1 second, Aaron, before you go. I was remiss in my moderating duties not to convey to you, since you can't see the room, the mix. At last count, I think we've got a little over 100 people here in the room, so you can imagine. I think the librarians have a slight edge on the publishers and other category, but I think you've a really receptive group for your context that you're going to offer. So take it away, Aaron.
Yeah, my name is Aaron, and I'm from Singapore. I'm sorry I can't actually join you in person. As mentioned, I'm an academic librarian, like many of you in the room. I focus a lot on discovery and information retrieval. And I first started getting interested in this roughly around the time of GPT-3. And I've been approached by startups and even established companies to try out tools that are leveraging large language models and other AI models to improve retrieval. So I've been looking at this for like maybe 3 years or so. And the way I usually explain to librarians in courses and workshops is that AI is changing retrieval in 2 ways. So the first way is that they are now retrieving and ranking results beyond using the normal Boolean methods. So they're using usually LLMs to either do the re-ranking, or they're using some sort of dense embedding. And of course, the other thing that retrieval is changing in search is that we no longer just rank the results. The LLMs try to summarize relevant data from the top retrieved results. So in the library world, I've spoken to many librarians, and there's a lot of uncertainty over how this will change retrieval. In more recent years, I think since last year, I've been very fascinated by the idea of agentic, or sometimes branded as deep research, where the search would go beyond just simple rec. So the earliest tools like I guess Site Assistant, Elicit, they were simple rec tools. You would ask a question, it would search for the top maybe 8 results or top 10 results. It would summarize the top 8 results, and you will get a response in maybe in about 10 seconds. The latest agentic tools, they would run off to work for maybe 30 minutes or half an hour, and they could generate a whole essay. And I think agentic tools are particularly interesting because they can do very deep searches, And the potential is far greater than just writing a literature review. So for example, I've been trying out tools, asking them to look at a set of papers, look at a certain paper, look at the references, and find citations to those references, and group them together. So the agentic search can go beyond just answering a simple question. You could actually task it to do some sort of bibliometric analysis. You could task it to look for papers that are related but were not cited in the paper. Yeah, but one of the questions I've been getting from librarians as well as researchers is the sources. Where are these AI tools getting the sources from? And I'm sure many of you are aware that very commonly tools like Illicit, Undermine, Site Assistant, they are generally drawing from open metadata sources. So they're drawing from things like Crossref or Semantic Scholar, Open Research Corpus, or OpenLX. And of course, this has disadvantages because it doesn't have access to a lot of abstracts or full text of things that are behind the paywall. And therefore, I'm very interested in the recent approach by Wiley, where they actually launched the Wiley AI Gateway, where it allows agents to actually access full text using the MCP server. So this is something that I'm looking forward to discuss during the panel. Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron. Now we'll hand over to Hilke for his brief intro.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hilke Koers. I'm the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions. And a couple of perspectives that I bring to the discussion from the STM and the STM solution side. I'm also involved in the task and finish group that Ralph spoke about, responsible content in LLMs and other AI applications. I also work on a task and finish group around researcher identity, and I am the program director for two pieces of enabling infrastructure that I think may be relevant in the context of this discussion, namely seamless access and getFTR. So from that perspective, while we were thinking through and preparing for this discussion, I think for me what really stood out are two questions that were very central to my thinking about this space of code for conduct, best practices again. How do we evaluate and what do we expect from AI agents? Specifically working to support research. And the first question is about in what sense can we really pin down how scholarly content is different from other forms of content on the web? There's a lot of AI agents out there, right? What makes an AI agent, an AI research agent special in that sense? And the second question is around how should we think about evaluating the performance of an AI agent in a way that's different than a human assistant? Does it make a fundamental, if you sort of zoom out, does it make a fundamental difference? And if so, in what sense? If we are looking at performance of an AI contra a human assistant, and why does that matter? So a couple of thoughts on the first question first. And there's two things I wanted to call out that at least to my mind are two very clear directions in which scholarly material stands out, is distinct, different from other forms of content in the web. And Ralph already alluded to some of it, so I'll keep it brief. But the first thing that I think is special about scholarly content, and of course this is a bit of an idealization, not every piece, not every publication does this equally well, but ideally the information that you need to verify or reproduce the content that is part of the publication travels together with the content. That could be instructions in the text, say in a journal article that explains in the method section how the research was conducted, how it could be reproduced, how it could be verified. That could also take the form of citations and attributions, of course. And I think there is a risk with AI in general and AI agents that they may strip some of that content, strip some of the context and the meaning, and sort of lose that instructions almost on how to validate, verify, reproduce the material that is embodied in that content. So one thing that I would assess my fictitious AI co-worker on is their ability to reliably preserve those pathways that allow me to go back and reproduce and verify. The second thing that I wanted to call out that to my mind is sort of special about scholarly content is the processes around quality assurance and quality improvements that are broadly applied, quite sophisticated. Peer review, of course, before publication, but also post-publication and sort of the long-term custodianship that publishing organizations exercise by issuing retractions or updates, corrigenda, if it comes to the attention that something may be amiss or that the article does not really fulfill the expectations of quality and ethics and integrity. So I'd also want my AI co-worker to really be mindful of that and understand this and the processes and use that to really critically assess the trustworthiness and the authority of different pieces of content that it encounters on its search journey. So the second question, how should we really think differently about sort of performance assessment of an AI assistant contra a human research assistant? And I thought it might be sort of a fun and potentially illuminating thought exercise to imagine myself writing a performance review for my AI agent. As somebody who has done performance review quite a bit, I never thought I would use the words fun and performance review in one sentence, but here we are. And I've sort of tried and forced myself to really be agnostic in terms of sort of the anthropomorphic properties of my AI. So I try to really ignore the question, is this a bot or is this a human? Just zoom out, look at what is the thing that it has done, and how do I assess that. I will call my assistant Alan and refer to him as he, just to keep it conversational. So on the strength, I have found Alan is most certainly a hard worker. He relentlessly tries to get the job done. No motivation issues. He's never come to me to sort of explain of fatigue or motivation issues in any sense. Very resourceful, never stops trying, open to feedback, and always happy to try again. That also translates to a couple of weaknesses. Some of my colleagues in my department have been complaining because he's really slamming their systems, often not very clear why. The intent is very fuzzy and unbounded, which means you can ask him a very specific thing, but then he goes to engage with all other sorts of systems that seem at face value to be totally unrelated, not unlike a toddler with more energy than attention span. Alan can also be a little cocky when it comes to presenting results, and I have found him on occasions to just be really bluffing his way. I've noticed that results can be inconsistent. Sometimes Alan says things at different times, maybe difference in your general attitude before or after coffee. Finally, Alan does not always provide me with the information that I need to really check if what he told me is really correct and what sources he has used for me to go back and do that verification and understand how he got to a certain conclusion. So that brings me to improvement points. I'd like Alan to just be open and be honest if he doesn't know things. It's okay to say, I don't know. And this may sound a little weird, but I'd also like Alan to sort of give up a bit more easily and at some point be more conscient about what is the amount of effort and resources that should go into asking, to addressing a particular question or a request. Finally, I'd like Alan to be a bit more consistent in outputs and give me proper citation and other information that I need to be able to verify and through verification eventually build trust in the answers that he gives me. Finally, one general comment. I have observed that many of my colleagues sort of express a sense of uneasiness about not understanding what's going on in Alan's silicon brain, how these LLMs are completely black box. I personally don't consider that to be a big issue when it comes to the performance assessment, as long, again, as I am able to interpret, verify, and ultimately trust what Alan brings me. Because after all, if I compare this to my human co-workers, who knows what's going on in their minds, and why is it so that we care more about what's going on in Alan's silicon brain compared to what's going on in the brains of my flesh and blood colleagues? Thank you.
Thanks for that, and hopefully you found it useful to have a little bit of stage setting there. So I have a few questions, but we do want to hear from you. We have a volunteer mic runner in our midst. Joni, can you just let folks see who you are? So if you do have a question, even now while we're talking to the folks up here on the stage for a little bit, you can wave Joni down. She's in the back, and she will come to you and indicate to me that there is a question. because we do want things to be lively, but I have a few tee-off questions for our group here. So I'm going to start with Hilke. This kind of discussion, is certainly broad-based, and it's been alluded to, the participation in the STM task and finish groups, conversations around collaboration. What does this type of issue say around the need for collaboration rather than kind of going it alone? Do we think that the AI agent will have to go to every individual publisher? Will there be some sort of big corpus? How do you kind of see that playing out?
Yeah, great question. And we've heard talks about supercontinent where all content can be discoverable. I was in a session a little bit earlier where we spoke about content syndication. I think this is a question that's been sort of pervasive in our community for a long time. Will there be, that single supercontinent that's the source of discovery for everything? I'm not sure, but I do think it's unlikely that everything will be completely in one place. I think the question is, what is the underlying capabilities in terms of the infrastructure to make things more consistently and comprehensively findable? And then if you sort of think through the various stages in the journey, sort of the rubric that I have in mind is going from the point of discovery. Do we need something like a discovery index or a whole list of points with trustworthy content can be discovered? Access, not only for humans, but also how does that translate to AI agents? A reminder to folks in the room that a lot of our access infrastructure is IP based. That's going to be very difficult for AI agents. Then the content delivery, Apurva, you know more about this than I do, with how do we make things fit for purpose for AI agents. The usage allocation, also a big topic, came up in a couple of discussions earlier in the conference. How are we able to track back how content has been used, not only in the presentation layer, but also in the underlying machinery? I do think there is a clear need for sort of common approaches, guidelines, potentially standardization for some of those questions.
Great. Do we have any comments from
I think
our
we
publishers?
probably all would like to comment on this one a little bit.
I'll give you a chance. Don't worry.
Apurva and I talked about this morning, actually, a little bit. And so I agree with Hilke. I think it's unlikely that we are going to have a supercontinent emerge of all research content out there, where there's one place where these agents can hit. On the other hand, I think it's also kind of untenable to think that we would have all of these, publisher-specific agents or sites, out there either. It seems like we probably have to find somewhere in the middle there, that will kind of make that orchestration layer work better. And you probably want to say something about that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's our intent with the AI Gateway, right, is to have that middle ground between aggregating all of the world's publisher content into one stream versus having an AI agent have to connect to 50 or 100 different endpoints to different MCP servers or different connection points to get this content. And so the way we've architected the AI Gateway is it's kind of federated, right? You have one endpoint, it's like one connection point, but then every publisher that's participating has their own partition content store and can kind of decide how they want to participate. Do they want to sell their content directly to customers? Do they want it included? Do they want certain components, certain types of content included and not other types? And so I think giving that freedom to publishers, because also we're talking about more than just journal content here, right? That when you think about an AI, it's lots of different types of content that it wants to consume, and I think it's an opportunity for us to think about different content types in a more unified way. Like, hey, if I'm doing a search on a particular topic like CRISPR, maybe I want to pull my agent to pull from a recent conference proceeding, maybe from a book, but also from a journal article. And so having that kind of come through and having different publishers decide what they want to include is part of the nature of kind of how the gateway is architected.
Great, and I want to bring Aaron in, and maybe we can take the slides down now and just leave Aaron on the screen. Awesome. So, Aaron, you've played with a lot of these tools. What are your thoughts on what this might look like?
Yeah, so I mean, this whole discussion about federated search reminds me about the debate we had in at least the library world about back then they were called web scale discovery services. So there was a debate over whether it would be a centralized index versus a federated approach. And back then, in the long run, the centralized index won. So things like Summon, EBSCO Discovery Service, and Primo today, they are mostly centralized indexes. Of course, the calculus is different now. But it does seem to me that if we move toward a federated search approach, If there are multiple small sources, I'm not sure how it might affect the latency. Like you were to search like 50 different places to cover everything, as opposed to a more centralized approach. Maybe there are like 5 main places to search by discipline. So that's the other thing I'm wondering about, like in terms of how this would play out. Other than that, I would say that from what I hear from researchers and librarians, there's a lot of appetite for AI for discovery and AI for literature review. Basically, because this is an area that most researchers are kind of familiar with and they are less resistant to, as opposed to, let's say, doing AI for doing analysis. Of course, that said, there's a lot of worries about bias, right? So right now, the bias could be due to the fact that a lot of these tools, they don't have access to the full text of paywall articles, but there also could be unknown bias, like for example, LLMs due to safeguards, due to rules, they refuse to answer certain types of questions. So there was a recent kind of blow up because a certain product they had a lot of safeguards that prevented it from answering questions that were somewhat political or sensitive. So there's the other concern for librarians right now about whether LLMs would have a bias in terms of how they search. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to stay with Aaron. When we planned for this session, we had some conversations around how this might be similar or different to conversations around TDM. So maybe you could kick us off with your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I naively thought that given that up to recently there's been solutions to allow researchers to do TDM, and my thoughts back then was that this will also apply to agents, that the agents will have the same TDM rights. But I think as we discussed, this is not something that has been settled. Like it'll probably be different from what TDM rights are. Yeah.
And another comparison that came up during the planning call was a suggestion from Apurva that maybe we could think of this as kind of a DVD versus streaming difference. Can we get that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity for publishers to think about the way that their content is delivered differently, right? That in the past we've had this idea of, hey, I've got a whole book or I've got a whole journal article or a whole journal that I'm selling to my subscribers. And I think what we're thinking about the gateway, it opens up these opportunities where you can open up whole collections of content that become streaming. Because the way that the gateway works is we don't pass ever the full text over to the agent. We're always passing the most relevant chunks or snippets of content based on the user's question. And so it is a streaming service in that way. I have a particular question, it'll search the entire database of whatever is available, and that right now is Wiley content, but eventually will be other publisher content as well, and it'll return back the most relevant thing. And so it's a different, and then it links to the original full text. That's a different play, right? It's like the DVD versus the streaming service. And so I think that's an important distinction between the two, and I think it opens up opportunities for how we think about providing our users content and the types of different connection points that a user would have with their agent.
Mm-hmm. I see we have a question in the back, and our questioner, please introduce yourself. You've done us the service that Joni didn't even have walk across the room to get to you. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I drank way too much caffeine today, so it felt good to stretch my legs. My name is Mark McBride. I'm with Ithaca SNR. Thank you for a great panel discussion. And you were pointing to a number of topics that led me to think about like ethics and AI. And so I'm just curious, is there actually going to be a time where we can actually see an AI agent developed with, let's say, scholarly conscious?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of the goal, I would say, of this task and finish group that Hilken and I mentioned, where we are trying to teach these AI agents what scholarly content means and have that full context. I think we're quite far away from that, to be really honest with you, because you have to get into almost like algorithmic certainties of the probability of this research result being scientifically conclusive, and we don't within our community, we don't have a good measure, a good metric for that. But that's kind of what these AI systems would need, is some algorithmic way of saying, the likelihood that that drug is going to cure, this symptom is incredibly high, while this one is not quite so high. That's the kind of thing that these agents will ultimately need to have, and I think it's going to take some time to be able to develop that.
If I could add to that, I think it also depends a little bit on the use case that you're solving for, right? If you want to have an AI agent that tells you conclusively what is the state of consensus, what are the different views, I agree, that's super, super complex. If you see an AI agent as initially a source of discovery, where people can then, do further research and just help them with that first step of the journey, it gets a little simpler. There's still, lots of qualities and attributes that you would like to be embodied. I'm an optimist by nature. I'm also relatively optimistic in the sense that I see some interest by organizations in the marketplace who also feel that this could be a differentiator for them to set their service apart from, say, the generic LLM and the generic AI organizations that are really, looking to develop tools that respect that ethos of science.
So I want to make a little counterpoint to you guys, and I think this comes down. We had this conversation when we were preparing for this session, which is how much emphasis or how much onus do we put on the agent versus the user, and I would say that actually the user responsibility is a critical part of this. That you can only go so far to make AI agents scholarly conscious, and I think this is actually a huge opportunity for librarians to teach users in their institutions to be better users of AI. And not to put trust on it, and to really be better. We talk a lot about prompt engineering and things like that. This is where it comes into play. If you set expectations to the AI for a certain set of integrity, it will follow those directions. If you don't, if you ask it for just a generic question, it will provide you a generic result and try to be as helpful as possible. And so I think we just have to really establish those right expectations. Again, the AI is built to be probabilistic. It's kind of unpredictable. You've seen it. You can ask the same prompt 5 times and you will get 5 different results. So you can't, I think it's hard for us to imagine a future where it's going to be foolproof and say, okay, we can 100% trust it. Maybe I'll be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I think it comes down to being better educated users and then connecting good content to it. There's a lot of content slop, and there's this slide that's out there now, the amount of AI generated content that's out there. What's going to happen is that increasingly AI will reference content generated by AI. And so then it just becomes this downward death spiral of bad content. And so we have to find an antidote to that. And I think that's part of the problem we're trying to solve. But I think it's a conversation we have to have of how do you actually educate users to be aware of that and to then find ways in their use of AI to solve that problem. I'd love to hear Aaron's thoughts on this.
Yeah, and Aaron, I see you nodding, so I assume you can hear us pretty well, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I think part of what I've been driving towards is for librarians to really learn more about how this AI search works. So like RAG, the understanding that RAG is actually looking at chunks of text rather than full paper. So this often the LLMs lack context. They are seeing only a certain chunk, and it's very easy to misinterpret what the paper is based on a certain chunk. And I see LLMs often failing because they see a chunk and they think this is what the author says, but it's actually what the author says somebody else says, and you don't have enough context. Right, so especially the model we're talking about with MCP, where all you get is a chunk of text rather than the full text of the paper. LLMs are very prone to actually make such errors, and I do agree that it will take a while, maybe at least for the next 5 years or so. They are likely to be prone to making errors, and therefore librarians should be able to train to understand these technologies and actually to kind of explain to users what these weak points are. Show examples where they tend to mess up, and basically gain a sense of where things tend to go wrong. Yeah, and I basically hold like a three session workshop on basically RAG and deep search and things like that.
I think we'd all like to take that workshop. We have another question on the side here.
Thank you. I'm David Banish from the University of South Carolina. I'm especially interested in this question of corrigenda and retractions, and you just alluded to slop and the undermining of confidence, I would say, in the scholarly record. It's interesting that you put this question or the burden or the onus back on the librarians to educate users about this. I recently had the opportunity to ask Holden Thorpe of AAAS about, where these things should appear. retractions and corrections and so on. And he said, well, there's really, no, he was speaking for himself, I assume, but, it's really no place that really belong in institutional repositories or subject repositories, or not in the publication, the scholarly record. It seemed akin to the answer that you've kind of alluded to here, that just train librarians to train people to find the faults. Where is the responsibility on the part of publishers, content providers, and designers of agents to make sure that these corrections, retractions, and so forth are taken into account properly? Many people will never be trained on the use of these agents, but they will certainly use them.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, the point was not to say that the entire onus is on library. I think it's an opportunity, and I think it is also a responsibility of publishers to make sure that the authoritative content is made accessible to these agents that the users are using, so that the agents that they're using are not doing a generic web search or relying on content that maybe shouldn't be part of the AI because it doesn't have the right rights to it. And so, there's a lot of issues there with sometimes people, if you're uploading a PDF that isn't supposed to have AI rights, that's misuse. And so I think that's on the publisher to provide the right pathway to that. One of the things we're doing with the gateway is, for example, we're flagging retractions right now, and we're actually actively talking about, do we just exclude all of them immediately? And the thing is, we can update that databases on a regular basis. And so if a user asks a question, and if it hits the database, if there are any retracted papers, they just don't show up in the search. And so there's ways, again, that you can kind of guarantee some of that. And again, if you don't have some type of interface like this to some trusted content source, the agent's going to rely on whatever it can find on the open web. And that's when you get into risky issues, or if, say, hey, the agent, people are just uploading PDFs. And so there's multiple levels of responsibility. The point about kind of user awareness is also just that, like, without that, there's always a possibility for misuse, and that things can go awry. And if you don't really understand how the AI works, and you're not going to notice it, and you're going to let things pass that maybe otherwise shouldn't have.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the specific context that you were referring to in that conversation, but I would say academic publishers absolutely feel that they have the responsibility for keeping that scientific record up to date and for publishing errata corrections, as needed. In the context of this conversation, we are really highlighting that point. This is to say that you ought, an AI developer ought to be looking to a publisher, the holder of the scientific record, for that very reason, so that if something changes, you would get a signal of that change. I will say this is an area where, as more and more open access content is made available out on the web, other than just the publisher site, this becomes a bit of a challenge, because when that content is hosted elsewhere and not on the publisher's site, when a retraction occurs, how do we make sure that that retraction propagates to every place out there on the web where that article might live? This is a use case that we're elucidating here to Gen AI developers, saying this is why you ought to be pointing to the publishers, as the source of truth for these things.
Yep. Hilke, and then Aaron.
Maybe I can comment a bit about the retractions. So I studied this a little bit myself, like testing to see whether they can tell a paper is retracted. And there was a recent study that also did this in depth. That study that was just published actually said that the LLMs couldn't tell whether a paper is retracted, even for very famous papers that were like famously retracted. But one thing I noticed about those studies was they were using very old models, like 4.0 mini. And when I repeated the study with a newer model, like a GPT-5 model, they could usually tell the papers retracted. So I think retractions is an issue that could eventually be solved by a combination of, say, having proper links to the retraction notice, and by more powerful models that basically put in more effort to search. So I don't think this is a very fundamental issue, but I do think that expecting LLMs to never hallucinate or never so-called misinterpret papers is something that is unlikely, because even human researchers also often miscite papers, right? So that's the place where libraries can play. But retractions, I'm fairly optimistic that through a combination of publishers putting proper links to retraction notices and more powerful models doing more effort to search, it is probably solvable, I believe.
Great. Now I want to go to Hilke, and we have about 15 minutes left, and so there's time for definitely a few more questions. So just let Joni know if you have a question. We've got a hand up on this side. Joni, if you want to head over. Hilke.
Thanks. I'll keep it brief. So my first point, definitely, I think research integrity is a responsibility for all of us in the rooms, including publishers, to shoulder some of that burden and effort. I spoke about these two processes that, to my mind, are quite make scholarly content specific and sort of set it apart from other content on the web, including these post-publication corrections. I think in the terms of translating that to the context of this conversation, what does that responsibility mean? It's about raising awareness and educating AI organizations about how that works and the importance of retractions and errata, etc. I also wanted to do a bit of a shout out to some of the other work that's happening to make retractions information more visible, because I do think collectively we can do a better job there. There's been some really good work from a NISO working group called CREC that comes up with recommendations, guidelines to have sort of more consistent signaling and expression and in both title but also metadata fields about retractions. And we're doing some work still quite exploratory within STM in partnership with GetFTR to see if we could make the information that's currently available about retractions from the Crossref database, that's sort of pool-based, to make that also available as a notification services so that it's easier to sort of get alerts if there are updates to the content that is in your database.
Thanks. Chris?
Thanks, everybody. Chris Shillam from ORCID. The general purpose AI tools, the OpenAIs, the Googles, the Anthropics, etc., getting enormous mindshare and usage. I assume, you know, the current generation of high schoolers and undergrads are making extensive use. But we also have these specialized tools being developed by all of our industry discovery vendors, which strikes me as a very kind of similar issue to the battle between Google Scholar and the current library discovery services. So I'm interested in your views on who's going to win that battle, or will we see the same metaphor of libraries buying those tools even though the users are not using them? And a slight follow-up, will we see the big tools having specialized versions for scholarly research? Will we see a Gemini Scholar emerge in the future?
That's a great question. Some recent research that Wiley has done with several thousand researchers has shown that 80% of researchers are using the general purpose tools, and only 20% have used the research-specific tools. So I think the data itself, and in our own kind of qualitative research, we've seen the same thing. It makes sense. You're doing most of your work there. If you're doing your other work there, then it makes sense for you to do your research there too. So I think we should be optimizing more for those general purpose tools. I think that's where it's at. In our partnership with Anthropic, we've seen they've actually created for learning a learning mode version of Claude. And so I think there is an opportunity in the future for these more, domain-specific use cases. The holy grail I mentioned earlier, the system instructions, the system prompts, everything that Hilke and Ralph were talking about earlier, the best kind of the holy grail version, maybe this is a pipe dream, is that they update the system instructions to teach the AI about some of these things. What does it mean when there's a retraction notice? What does a version of record look like? And I think if we can get that in there, so far they hold that very tight because it's a limited amount of content that they can have in there, and they really want to tweak it, and they're always tweaking it. One of the things that happened when ChatGPT 5 came out, people were upset that it changes personality. They changed the system prompt, and that's what led to that. And so I think one of the things that we can advocate as an industry is, hey, how do we get these AI companies to add more of that context? And maybe it's not in the general purpose one, but a Gemini Scholar or ChatGPT Scholar version of that. It's a great question.
Yeah, and maybe that's where we ultimately lead to in terms of this task and finish group that we keep coming back to, and the ultimate goal there. Apoorva said this morning to me, almost think of the MCP as, an API on steroids, where the API has context, and maybe we can bake that scholarly context into that MCP instructions so that all of those tools, have some awareness of what scholarly content really is.
Aaron?
Yeah, so again, we're talking about like general tools versus specialized tools. So by definition, the general tools like Google and Google Scholar will always have more usage than a specialized tool like, say, Scopus or Web of Science. So I don't think it will change for AI. But I do notice is that when my researchers and faculty use something like OpenAI's deep research or Perplexity deep research, they tend to be very unhappy because the tools are currently don't seem to be customized for academic use. So they have awkward citations, they don't have inline citations, and they tend to draw from like not very academic sources, even though you can specify for academic sources. And when you compare to a specialized tool like, say, Elicit or Undermine, they are a lot more happy. But again, this is like a small percentage of researchers that really want the best results. But of course, I've tried like Claude with the Wiley AI MCP server, and I did notice the results a lot better because I guess it can look into the full text of papers, at least chunks of the full text. So I do think that it's very hard to predict the future, but we might go in two directions where we could have things like Claude and OpenAI that you can connect to MCP servers, as well as very specialized tools like Undermine, which will have specialized visualizations. We have built-in specialized instructions to understand the scholarly context better. I don't think it's likely that OpenAI is going to put in like scholarly specific instructions into the system prompt because it's too specialized for them. Yeah.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Because I have a question, but I don't want to take away anybody's question time. Okay, I'm going to ask a question around business models. So for the publishers maybe first, and we do have a lot of publishers in the room, so I'd be interested if you've got feedback on business models. How does this new way of surfacing, accessing content change the way publishers, maybe your publishers, are thinking about business models?
Yeah, good question. For several decades, we have operated reading platforms, right? We have operated effectively, better or worse, PDF delivery platforms for researchers to download content. This is a significant change in business model, kind of what we were said earlier about going from the iTunes model of individual songs being downloaded to the Spotify model of everything's out there and you can have whatever you want. We do not have an answer to that question. I think ACS is just like everyone else, kind of pondering that, doing experiments and doing some pilots and things like that. But that business model question is huge, and we don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah, and our view of this is let's get users using it first, and then let's let the business model come from that, as opposed to trying to architect some perfect business model in a boardroom and then try to take that out. I think we want to see where users are at, get usage. We launched in the Claude official connector directory, our Scholar Gateway connector. We've had about 1,500 people around the world sign up and start using it for free. We're not charging them anything. We just want to see the usage. We want to see how people are actually interacting with this content. And then if it creates value, then that justifies a monetary exchange. But you have to create the value first. And I think we're still at the stage right now where we haven't really determined exactly where that value is. We believe it's there in our own testing, but we want to see where that leads to. And then that will then lead to the business models. But I think it's a little bit premature right now to have a hard and fast rule about that.
Okay, Hilke?
I also don't have the answer to the question what's going to be the business model here of the future, but I do want to sort of add to the discussion that I think a necessary condition is going to be to have some form of measurement on how the content is actually being used also behind the scenes. So coming back to that sort of question of how do we measure usage, somewhere in the engine. And I think for a long time, at least I've heard people make the argument that this is just categorically impossible. We are seeing also a couple of sort of innovative companies now formulating approaches and solutions that do make it possible to also attribute some form of usage, or maybe at the end of the day, as a proxy for value to how the content was used in the inner engines of how an answer is being composed. So no definite answer, but I do see some interesting developments that suggest that this may not be the intractable problem that people thought it would be for a long time.
Aaron, are you going to solve our business model question today?
Well, I can tell you the librarian viewpoint. We don't have the money to pay extra. That will always be the librarian viewpoint. But I do think it's kind of interesting that if, let's say, you have a separate model where, you can use the AI to search for chunks, and then it gives you the answers. You pay a fixed price for that, and then after that, you pay for whatever full text you want after whatever the AI found, right? That seems to be a very different model than what we're doing now, where we are paying in advance the journals that we want. So again, as mentioned, we probably need to do a lot more testing to see where the value lies.
Great. I have a last question. And because I could see all the faces in the room when we were talking about the librarian's responsibility on campus. So we do a lot of librarian interviews at Delta Think, and we've talked about, who's paying for AI tools now, who could pay for them. I know there's a lot of possibilities on campus where maybe the CIO or the CTO might be involved, or there might be potentially diverse budgets, but how can we expand the stakeholder map on campus to make sure that we're engaging more broadly than just putting this on the shoulder of librarians? I'm going to start with Aaron first as our librarian representative on the panel, and then I'll ask the others to come in, and then we will adjourn. So, Aaron.
Yeah, so again, it's hard to say. For some institutions, it might be fronted by the IT department. In my institution, they actually kind of prefer for the library to actually take the lead to train in things like Copilot, Microsoft Copilot. But for academic-related tools, we are generally asked to actually train users on this. And speaking to a lot of librarians also, I know that it's very stressful because this is an area that we are not traditionally very strong in. I mean, we are good at searching in general, but when it comes to AI, most of us don't have actual formal training in information retrieval and AI. So this is an area that is something that I guess it depends on the institution. For my institution, at least for me, I find it fun to understand and study such tools. And so this is an area that I've been trying to train other librarians, as I said, in workshops. And I can tell you that there are a lot of librarians who are very, very curious about this whole area.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left, so you each get a minute.
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, I think the idea is that for the library is an opportunity. There was a session earlier today about more partnership with other parts of the institution, how to work with the provost's office, how to work with student success, how to work with your technology division. And I think this context, this idea of AI and connecting it to good content is an opportunity to build and support some of those bigger strategic objectives. Because I think at the same time as we see library budgets going down or flat, we see investments happening in different AI tools. But we want those tools to be connected to good content. Those tools on their own are highly problematic, and put into the wrong hands, there's a huge issue. So this is less about, okay, now I just have to add more work and do more training, and more about actually building a partnership in the university, focusing on those big strategic goals around career-connected education, around student success, around better research outcomes, and equipping different students and faculty members who may not otherwise have used these AIs in the best way possible to do that. So I think that's the opportunity there, is that kind of more of a partnership across the entire stakeholder map. And if that leads to more investments in these types of strategic and tools and services, then that's even better.
So I suffered a hallucination, and Joni tells me there is one more question. So we will take this last question, a few final remarks, and we will release you to your day.
Hello, I'm Cameron Cardan. I'm the co-founder of Zendi. We are one of those who have come up with that Spotify business model approach to accessing scholarly literature, because the whole purpose was to remove barriers in accessing the literature and providing an affordable alternative to, for example, the pirated sites that are out there. Now, when it came to AI, we also believed in the whole collaboration aspect, because it's not something that only one stakeholder can solve. And we actually came up with a business model, going back to that question of business models, which was based on not a one-time license where you take the content and then what happens to the content is not there. In order to keep and maintain those live relationships with the publishers to make sure that retractions are taken care of on any corrections and the data is correct, we came up with a live revenue share model. And actually, Wiley was one of the first publishers who was on board and adopted to that. So what it means is there's a current relationship with the publisher, the AI gets included through RAG and MCPs in the answers, but at the same time, because of that relationship, any changes in the data that appears in the system, and the revenue share was the first in the sort of the academic community for a company to come up with a revenue share model, was actually based on measures linked to the usage. Or in, for example, in a AI assistant model is the citations. So whenever a piece of information is used from content, that counts as a contribution from that publisher. And it can be even granular to the author level. So these sort of, that relationship between the readers, the publishers, and the authors can be very open and transparent. So there are models out there, and they're being experimented. Wiley has been an early adopter to take on board, but it's a growing collaboration, and we're hoping to make this grow.
All right. I would like to thank our speakers one more time today. Thank you guys for sticking with us, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your conference. Thank you.